There is a silence buried beneath the earth, a silence made of stone and bone, of scroll and clay, of shattered monuments that once touched the sky. For thousands of years, civilizations rose and fell, leaving only fragments behind. Most of what humanity once built was swallowed by deserts, drowned by rivers, or hidden beneath layers of soil. For centuries, these traces were thought to be myths, stories sung around fires, tales too extraordinary to be true. Yet, each time a stone was lifted or a script deciphered, the past whispered again, and the silence turned into a voice. This is not only the story of discovery, it is the story of how we first learned to listen, of how broken walls and forgotten tablets became messengers across time, of how science and imagination met in the dust of forgotten temples. Each artifact is not only an object but a bridge, a portal that collapses the distance between us and those who lived thousands of years ago. In this journey, we will follow the most profound discoveries that reshaped human history, moments when myths became maps, when stories became science, and when the past returned to life. From lost cities and sacred scrolls to machines ahead of their time, every revelation was more than a treasure. It was a revolution of understanding. And as the Earth continues to keep secrets, one truth remains clear. History is not finished. It is still being uncovered, one whisper at a time. Long before the science of archaeology was born, there was only curiosity, a restless wonder about the ruins scattered across the ancient world. Travelers in Greece, in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, walked among fallen temples and broken statues without fully grasping what they meant. They saw great stones half buried in sand, fragments of columns rising like bones from the earth, and inscriptions carved in languages no one alive could read. To them, these were monuments of mystery, relics of forgotten powers, reminders that humanity had not always been as it was. Yet, without the tools to understand them, these ruins were like books written in a lost tongue, filled with knowledge but locked away. Herodotus, often called the father of history, was among the first to try to listen. In the 5th century before the Common Era, he traveled widely across Egypt, Babylon, and the lands of the Eastern Mediterranean. He spoke with priests, studied temples, and recorded stories told by local guides. His writings were not archaeology in the modern sense. They were filled with myth, exaggeration, and rumor. Yet they carried something essential. He treated ruins not as curiosities but as evidence, as voices of the past that deserved to be recorded. Even if he misinterpreted what he saw, Herodotus planted the seed of an idea that the remains of the past could speak if only someone learned how to listen properly. Centuries passed, and the ruins remained silent. In medieval Europe, broken statues from Rome were treated as curiosities or even as talismans. Fragments of marble were collected not for their history but for their beauty. Medieval travelers to the East wrote of wonders but often mixed them with fantasy. It was not until the Renaissance that antiquarians, wealthy collectors, and early scholars began to gather artifacts systematically. They did not yet have the discipline of archaeology, but they had fascination. Coins, vases, tablets, and fragments of temples were studied, copied, and sometimes hoarded. What mattered was that the past was no longer invisible. It was being catalogued, described, and slowly, however imperfectly, understood. But the real turning point came not with statues or monuments, but with language. For what use were the walls of Egypt's temples if the inscriptions carved into them remained a mystery? What use were tablets from Mesopotamia if their symbols were only strange scratches? A civilization is more than its stones. It is its words, its prayers, its laws, its stories. Without the key to language, the past remained mute. This silence lasted for centuries until a remarkable discovery changed everything. In the summer of 1799, during Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, a group of French soldiers near the town of Rashid, known in the West as Rosetta, unearthed a slab of dark stone. It was not golden, not adorned with jewels, yet it would prove more valuable than any treasure chest. On its surface were three parallel inscriptions, one written in Greek, which scholars could read, one written in Egyptian demotic script, the everyday writing of the people, and one in Egyptian hieroglyphs, the sacred symbols carved into temples and tombs. This single stone, later called the Rosetta Stone, offered something no artifact ever had. It was a code, a bridge between the known and the unknown. For centuries, the hieroglyphs of Egypt had been seen as pure decoration, mystical symbols without phonetic meaning. Even great minds believed they were nothing more than allegorical pictures. The Rosetta Stone proved otherwise. If the Greek text matched the Egyptian hieroglyphs, then the symbols were not mere art. They were words, sentences, a full written language waiting to be unlocked. The challenge, however, was enormous. Scholars debated for decades, poring over the stone, copying its inscriptions, comparing each symbol against the Greek text. In the early 19th century, the English scholar Thomas Young made critical progress, recognizing that some of the symbols spelled the names of rulers. But it was Jean-François Champollion of France who finally broke the code. In 1822, after years of study, Champollion realized that hieroglyphs were a complex mixture of phonetic signs and symbolic ones. They were not an unbreakable mystery. They were a language, rich and precise. When he stood before the Académie des Inscriptions and read aloud the first words of ancient Egypt in more than 1,000 years, it was as if the dead had spoken. With the Rosetta Stone deciphered, an entire civilization was reborn. Suddenly, the temples of Luxor and Karnak were not silent monuments, but vast libraries. The walls of pyramids revealed prayers to the gods, instructions for the afterlife, and the rituals of kings. Tombs spoke of families, trades, and even personal letters. The veil was lifted, and Egypt was no longer myth. It was history, alive with voices. This moment was more than a triumph of scholarship. It was the birth of archaeology as a science. From that point on, ruins were not simply admired or collected, they were interrogated. Each inscription, each shard of pottery, each buried tablet became a witness to human history. The past was no longer lost, it was recoverable, piece by piece, through patient study and careful excavation. The Rosetta Stone did more than unlock a language, it unlocked a method, a way of thinking. If Egypt's secrets could be revealed, then what of Mesopotamia's clay tablets, covered in wedge-shaped marks no one could yet understand? What of the ruins described in myths and epics, waiting beneath the soil? The 19th century would be an age of discovery, where myth and memory collided with science. And the first spark, the first clear voice from antiquity, had come from a simple stone found in the sands of Egypt. As the 19th century dawned, a new hunger spread across Europe. Scholars, adventurers, and dreamers began to believe that the stories of the past could be proven, that the myths sung in epic poems might conceal real histories, that under every hill and ruin there might be a buried truth waiting to be revealed. The silence of millennia was over, the past had spoken, and humanity was listening. The 19th century was a century of obsessions. The rediscovery of language through the Rosetta Stone had lit a fire that swept through Europe. Scholars and explorers no longer looked at ancient ruins as silent curiosities. They were now seen as puzzles, fragments of a grand story waiting to be pieced together. And as with every great obsession, the pursuit of the past became as much about human passion and rivalry as about stones and inscriptions. Jean-François Champollion himself embodied this passion. He had devoted his life to deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphs, often at the expense of his health. His notes were filled with feverish comparisons, endless lists of symbols, desperate sketches drawn in dim candlelight. He carried with him a personal sense of destiny, convinced that unlocking the voice of Egypt would place him in history alongside the great thinkers of antiquity. When he finally cracked the code, he did not simply offer a new scholarly tool, he reshaped the very imagination of Europe. Suddenly, the pyramids and temples were not mute monuments, but echoes of kings and priests, farmers and builders. The fascination with Egypt reached fever pitch. Travelers rushed to the Nile, artists filled sketchbooks with drawings of statues and tombs, and collectors bought or looted artifacts to fill European museums. Egyptomania was born. Yet archaeology in those days was not yet a science of precision. Excavations were often hasty, sometimes careless, driven by treasure hunting rather than careful study. Tombs were plundered for golden masks and jewels, while fragile papyri crumbled to dust. The hunger for discovery sometimes destroyed the very knowledge that scholars sought to preserve. And still, even in this flawed beginning, something profound was happening. Humanity was learning how to read its own memory. While Egypt was opening its secrets, another land held tablets even older, even more mysterious. In the deserts of Mesopotamia, near the ruins of ancient Babylon and Nineveh, clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped marks were being unearthed. To the untrained eye, they looked like nothing more than scratched bricks. Yet these tablets contained one of the earliest forms of writing known to humanity, cuneiform. The challenge of reading them was monumental. Unlike hieroglyphs, there was no Rosetta Stone to offer a bilingual key. Scholars had to labor slowly, comparing symbols, tracing patterns, and daring to imagine what voices might emerge from these marks pressed into clay thousands of years ago. By the mid-19th century, men like Henry Rawlinson took up the challenge. Rawlinson, a soldier and scholar stationed in Persia, risked his life climbing the sheer cliffs of Behistun to copy a massive inscription carved into the rock by order of King Darius of Persia. The Behistun inscription, like the Rosetta Stone, contained the same text written in multiple scripts, including Old Persian and Babylonian cuneiform. It became the key to cracking the code of Mesopotamia. Piece by piece, Rawlinson and his colleagues deciphered the symbols, revealing royal proclamations, trade records, religious hymns, and epics. Among them lay one of the greatest literary treasures of the ancient world, the Epic of Gilgamesh, a tale older than Homer, speaking of friendship, mortality, and the search for immortality. When the Epic of Gilgamesh was first read in modern times, it was a shock to the European imagination. Here was a story, thousands of years older than the Bible, describing a flood sent by the gods, a righteous man who built a boat, and a world reshaped by divine will. Echoes of Noah's Ark appeared in these ancient lines, suggesting that the stories of Genesis were not unique, but part of a much older human memory. For the first time, myths that had been thought timeless were seen in a new light, as part of a shared human heritage stretching back into the mists of time. This was the true revolution of archaeology. It was not only about collecting objects, but about shattering assumptions. The Bible, long seen in Europe as the first and ultimate record of history, was now joined by texts older still. The gods of Mesopotamia, the kings of Sumer, the builders of Babylon, were no longer names without meaning. They were real, their voices preserved in clay. Archaeology had begun to question, to challenge, to expand the boundaries of what was known. The pursuit of ancient knowledge soon became an international competition. Nations poured resources into expeditions, not only to learn, but to claim prestige. British, French, and German scholars raced to uncover treasures and ship them home. Great museums like the British Museum in London and the Louvre in Paris filled their halls with colossal statues, winged bulls from Assyria, sarcophagi from Egypt, and scrolls from forgotten libraries. The ruins of the East became theaters of rivalry, where science and nationalism intertwined. Yet beneath the politics and the plundering, something greater was unfolding. Humanity was piecing together its own forgotten story. Every new deciphered text, every excavated temple, every artifact placed under glass was part of a larger revelation. Civilizations that had been thought mythical were proven real. Cultures once dismissed as primitive revealed astonishing complexity. The past was no longer a distant shadow. It was alive, documented, and connected. Still, for all these discoveries, the process was fragile. Mistakes were common, interpretations often flawed. Early archaeologists sometimes projected their own beliefs onto the past, reading more into inscriptions than the evidence allowed. But even these errors were part of progress. Each mistake corrected, each debate resolved, sharpened the method. The science of archaeology was learning how to discipline itself, how to balance passion with precision. By the end of the 19th century, the silence of the ancient world had been broken in multiple tongues. Egyptian hieroglyphs, Mesopotamian cuneiform, Persian inscriptions, and the forgotten alphabets of the Levant had all begun to speak again. humanity was hearing voices not heard for millennia. And with every translation, every excavation, the world grew richer, more connected, more aware that its roots stretched back further and deeper than anyone had imagined. But the 19th century did more than uncover texts and temples. It reshaped the very idea of history. Where once myth had been accepted as truth, now evidence was demanded. Where once ancient ruins were only curiosities, now they were data, clues, testimonies. The human story was no longer a chain of legends, but a tapestry of evidence. And yet, legends still held their allure. For even as scholars translated clay tablets and catalogued statues, whispers persisted of cities still waiting beneath the earth, stories yet to be proven or disproven. It was this interplay between myth and excavation, between poetry and stone, that would drive the next great age of discovery. For if language could be unlocked, then perhaps even Homer's epics, sung for centuries as tales of gods and heroes, might point to something real. The world began to wonder, was Troy only a story, or was it buried somewhere, waiting for its walls to rise again under the touch of the spade? The desire to prove myth with stone and inscription was not only an academic pursuit, it was a hunger that stirred the imagination of ordinary readers, poets, and explorers alike. For thousands of years, epics had been recited, tales of heroes and gods who strode across the ancient world. The Rosetta Stone and the deciphering of cuneiform had shown that words could outlast empires, but another question remained. Could stories themselves be maps? Could legends point to real places buried beneath centuries of soil and sand? Throughout the 19th century, Europe found itself caught between two visions of the past. On one hand, the rational, scientific approach of scholars demanded hard evidence, inscriptions, and artifacts catalogued with care. On the other hand, the romantic imagination sought to bring to life the grandeur of Homer, the journeys of Odysseus, the walls of Troy. This tension gave archaeology both its rigor and its drama. For every careful translation of a tablet, there was also the dream of rediscovering a city, once thought only a myth. The ground itself seemed to cooperate with these dreams. In the Mediterranean world, ruins appeared almost everywhere. Farmers unearthed fragments of pottery while tilling their fields. Shepherds stumbled across broken columns in forgotten valleys. Travelers reported massive walls half swallowed by earth, foundations of structures whose builders were long forgotten. To those with imagination, each fragment was a clue. Somewhere beneath these scattered stones lay the buried roots of the great epics. Yet caution was necessary. Not every legend was anchored in fact. Some stories belonged to the realm of imagination, symbolic tales passed from one generation to another. But others hinted at truth. The flood described in Mesopotamian tablets and echoed in the Bible suggested a shared memory of real ancient catastrophes. The accounts of Egyptian dynasties, once thought exaggerated, proved to align with inscriptions on temple walls. Slowly, scholars came to realize that myth and history were not always separate worlds. Often they overlapped, each containing fragments of reality that the other lacked. This realization was thrilling, but also dangerous. The more archaeology proved legends to have some basis in fact, the more the public demanded that all myths be tested. Writers and newspapers sensationalized discoveries. Was the Garden of Eden to be found in Mesopotamia? Were the walls of Jericho still standing beneath layers of rubble? Was there a real city of Troy, where warriors once clashed and kings watched from burning towers? Archaeology was becoming more than science. It was becoming theater, a stage on which national pride, human ambition, and the hunger for wonder all played their roles. Scholars published translations of cuneiform texts that spoke of kings long forgotten, and these texts were devoured by readers hungry for glimpses of a world older than the Bible. Tourists crowded Egypt, carrying home fragments of the past as souvenirs. Collectors filled drawing rooms with artifacts that had once lain in tombs. The past was no longer hidden. It was being consumed, reshaped into a spectacle. But beneath the spectacle, genuine science was maturing. Excavations became more methodical. Layers of soil were mapped, artifacts catalogued with increasing care. The importance of context began to be recognized. A statue was not just an object of beauty. It was evidence, part of a story that could only be told if one knew where it had stood, what lay around it, what inscriptions accompanied it. Archaeology was learning patience. By the end of the 19th century, the discipline had been transformed. No longer the pastime of collectors alone, it had become a field in which scholars competed not only for treasures, but for knowledge. Universities established departments devoted to the study of antiquity. Journals published debates over translations and discoveries. The spade and the notebook became symbols of a new profession. Yet for all its new rigor, archaeology never lost its romance. Each expedition still carried with it the thrill of stepping into the unknown, of peeling back the layers of time to reveal what had been hidden for millennia. Every discovery was a revelation. To hold a tablet that had once passed through the hands of a Babylonian scribe was to feel the breath of history. To stand before a newly uncovered temple wall, its colors still bright after thousands of years in darkness, was to feel the past reaching forward into the present. And always, at the edge of discovery, myth waited. The world was full of stories yet to be tested, of cities said to lie in ruins, of kings remembered in song but not yet proven in stone. The decipherment of hieroglyphs and cuneiform had shown that languages could rise again from silence. But what of the cities themselves? Could the walls described by Homer be more than poetry? Could Troy, long thought a tale of imagination, be a real place still waiting beneath the soil of Asia Minor? The 19th century closed with these questions burning brightly. Archaeology had given humanity a new way to listen to the past. The first voices had spoken through stones and inscriptions, breaking a silence of thousands of years. But greater revelations lay ahead. Revelations that would blur the line between myth and history, between epic and excavation. The spade would soon strike earth where no one expected, and what it uncovered would change not only the story of Homer, but the very way the world understood its own origins. The past had begun to speak. Now it was about to roar. For centuries, the story of Troy had lived only in words. Homer's Iliad, composed in the deep mists of antiquity, spoke of a war between Greeks and Trojans, of gods taking sides, of heroes clashing beneath the high walls of a mighty city. For poets and scholars in classical Greece, these epics were both history and myth, guiding their culture's understanding of heroism and fate. For Romans, Troy became the seed of their own mythic past, the origin from which Aeneas fled to found a new destiny. For medieval Europe, the tales of Troy were retold in new forms, woven into chivalric romances and chronicles. Yet by the modern age, most believed the city never existed at all. It was poetry, not history, the creation of a bard whose verses were meant to stir hearts, not record facts. The 19th century, however, was an age of restless curiosity. The deciphering of ancient scripts had taught scholars that myths could sometimes conceal real memories. When clay tablets spoke of a flood, when inscriptions confirmed dynasties once thought legendary, the idea grew irresistible. If Gilgamesh had once walked in Mesopotamia, could Hector and Achilles have once faced each other on the plains of Asia Minor? Could the towers of Ilium, sung of for thousands of years, still lie buried beneath the soil? The man who would attempt to answer this was not a scholar in the usual sense. Heinrich Schliemann was a German businessman, a man of relentless energy and obsession. Born in poverty, he had risen through trade, mastering languages and amassing a fortune. But wealth was never enough. From childhood, he had been possessed by Homer. He claimed that hearing verses of the Iliad recited in his youth had ignited a lifelong mission to find the city of Troy and prove the truth of the epic. To many academics, Schliemann was reckless, untrained, and dangerously romantic. Yet, it was precisely this combination of obsession and audacity that would lead him to one of the most dramatic discoveries of the 19th century. Schliemann scoured the ancient texts, tracing the descriptions of landscapes in Homer's epics. He studied the coastline of modern Turkey, where tradition had long placed the site of Troy. Others had searched before him, but they looked in the wrong places, guided by guesses and fables rather than by method. Schliemann's determination, however, led him to the hill of Hisarlik, near the Dardanelles. Here, a mound rose above the plain, covered in grass and stones. To the casual eye, it was nothing but a hill. To Schliemann, it was the perfect place for a city that had been destroyed and rebuilt across centuries, its ruins piled layer upon layer beneath the earth. In 1871, Schliemann began to dig. His methods were crude by modern standards. He tore deep trenches through the mound, destroying much of the archaeological context in his haste to find the treasures he believed lay beneath. Yet fortune seemed to favor his recklessness. Beneath the soil, he uncovered massive walls, stone fortifications that had once encircled a settlement. As his team dug deeper, they discovered evidence of multiple cities built atop each other, each destroyed in turn by fire, earthquake, or war. The mound of Hisarlik was not the ruin of a single city, but of many, stacked like pages of history written upon the same ground. Schliemann was convinced he had found Homer's Troy. In 1873, he made the announcement that would electrify Europe. He had discovered what he called Priam's treasure, a cache of gold and jewels hidden in the ruins. Necklaces, diadems, and golden cups gleamed in the light, artifacts that Schliemann believed had once belonged to the royal family of Troy. He even placed a golden diadem upon the head of his wife Sophia, photographing her as if she were Helen herself reborn. Newspapers across Europe erupted in fascination. The city of Troy, long thought a myth, had been unearthed by a self-taught adventurer. The discovery was not without controversy. Scholars accused Schliemann of exaggeration, of romanticizing his finds. Later studies would reveal that the treasure he called Priam's did not belong to the era of Homer's Troy, but to a much earlier settlement buried deeper in the mound. His haste and destructive excavation methods obliterated much valuable evidence, making it difficult to reconstruct the true sequence of history at Hisarlik. Yet despite these flaws, one fact could not be denied. Beneath the soil of Turkey lay the remains of a great city, a city whose scale and fortifications matched the descriptions of Homer more closely than anyone had dared to believe. The implications were profound. Homer's epics, once thought to be pure myth, now stood on the border between poetry and history. The walls of Troy were real. The plains where Achilles might have pursued Hector were real. Whether the Trojan War happened exactly as described was still uncertain, but the discovery proved that the epic was not spun from air. It was anchored in a place, in stone, in memory. The line between legend and archaeology had blurred. As Europe debated, more excavations followed. Successive layers revealed a complex history stretching back thousands of years. Troy was not a single city, but many, built and rebuilt over time. One layer showed evidence of destruction by fire, suggesting a violent end that might align with Homer's tale. Another revealed artifacts that linked Troy to the wider trade networks of the Bronze Age, showing that it was not an isolated settlement but a thriving hub of culture and exchange. Each discovery added new depth, new complexity to the story. The effect on the imagination of the world was enormous. If Troy had been real, what other myths might contain kernels of truth? Could Atlantis, whispered of by Plato, have a hidden reality? Could the stories of lost cities in jungles and deserts point to civilizations yet to be uncovered? Archaeology was no longer confined to inscriptions and monuments. It had become a quest to test the very foundations of myth, to weigh poetry against the soil and see which verses could stand. The birth of modern archaeology had begun with the unlocking of languages, with the Rosetta Stone and the tablets of Mesopotamia. But with Troy, archaeology gained something new: drama. It was no longer only about deciphering symbols. It was about proving legends, bringing the stage of epic poetry into the light of history. And in doing so, it captured not only the minds of scholars, but the hearts of the public. The announcement of Troy's discovery reverberated across Europe like thunder. For a society enthralled by classical education, where the verses of Homer were studied in every school, the idea that a legendary city had been unearthed was intoxicating. The newspapers printed illustrations of the golden diadems, necklaces, and goblets, each captioned with the names of Priam, Hecuba, or Helen. For many, the line between history and myth dissolved. Troy was real, and therefore the Trojan War was real. The age of heroes had stepped into the light of archaeology, but reality was more complicated. Scholars quickly raised doubts. The treasure that Schliemann so triumphantly displayed could not be securely tied to the age of Homer. The layer of ruins from which it was drawn dated many centuries earlier, perhaps to the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. The city described in the Iliad, if it existed, would have been destroyed around the 12th century before the Common Era, during the turmoil of the Late Bronze Age. Schliemann, in his haste and eagerness to confirm his dream, had blurred the boundaries of time. His reckless trenching through the mound had destroyed much of the stratigraphy, the delicate layering of earth that reveals how one era rises upon another. In his search for Troy, he had buried other histories forever. Still, the truth was not simple dismissal. Excavations by later archaeologists, conducted with greater care, confirmed that the mound at Hisarlik did indeed hold the remains of a powerful city at the end of the Bronze Age. Its walls were formidable, its citadel imposing, its destruction sudden. While it could not prove the exact battle sung by Homer, it showed that a city existed which could well have inspired the legend. Whether or not Achilles and Hector had truly faced one another, there had been a real Troy, and it had fallen in flames. The debates that followed were not mere academic quarrels. They spoke to something deeper about the relationship between myth and history. Could poetry preserve memory across centuries? Could the imagination of a bard capture fragments of truth about events long past? The Iliad was not a historical chronicle. It was a poem filled with gods and divine interventions, with speeches and symbols shaped for performance. Yet beneath the verses, some kernel of fact seemed to endure. Archaeology had forced scholars to ask how human memory works, how stories travel through time, and how they can preserve echoes of places long buried. Schliemann himself became a figure of legend, both admired and condemned. He had proven bold enough to seek where others had doubted, but reckless enough to damage what he sought. To some, he was the visionary who restored Troy to the world. To others, he was a destroyer, a man whose crude methods robbed future generations of knowledge. Yet no one could deny that his passion had changed the field. He had shown that myths could be tested, that epic poetry could guide the spade as surely as inscriptions on stone. As his fame grew, Schliemann continued to dig, turning his attention to Mycenae in Greece. There he uncovered shaft graves filled with golden masks, weapons, and treasures. Holding a golden mask he had unearthed, he declared that he had looked upon the face of Agamemnon himself, the king who had led the Greeks against Troy. Once again, the newspapers erupted with excitement, and once again scholars raised doubts. The graves were magnificent but older than the period described by Homer. Yet here too the message was unmistakable. The world of the Iliad was no fantasy. It was rooted in real cultures, real kings, real wars of the Bronze Age. In this way, archaeology and poetry began to dance with one another. Archaeology gave poetry flesh, grounding it in ruins, walls, and weapons. Poetry gave archaeology soul, infusing discoveries with meaning beyond mere objects. A stone wall might be just a wall, but when placed beside the Iliad, it became the backdrop to a clash of heroes. A golden mask might be just a mask, but in the public imagination, it became the visage of Agamemnon himself. The rediscovery of Troy also stirred deeper questions about the nature of history itself. Was history the record of what truly happened, measured by inscriptions and ruins? Or was history also the memory of how people chose to tell their stories, the myths and epics that carried truths of a different kind? Archaeology had begun to show that both were necessary. Stones and scrolls could confirm dates and events, but myths preserved the emotional core of human experience, the way people understood their struggles, losses, and triumphs. To dismiss myth entirely was to lose half the story. To accept it blindly was to risk fantasy. The challenge was balance. The fascination with Troy reshaped the public image of archaeology. No longer was it a field confined to scholars deciphering dusty tablets in libraries. It became an adventure, a quest to unearth legends, to walk in the footsteps of heroes. Travelers to Turkey visited Hisarlik, standing upon the exposed walls and imagining the clash of chariots. Writers and artists drew inspiration from the discoveries, blending science and romance. Even as scholars argued over layers of soil, the public imagination was fixed on the idea that the epics of Homer had at last found their home. But the rediscovery of Troy did more than captivate the 19th century. It set a precedent that would echo into the future. It taught archaeologists that myth could not be dismissed out of hand, that legends often held fragments of memory, however distorted. It also taught them the danger of wishful thinking, of allowing passion to blind method. Every spade of earth removed carried responsibility, for it destroyed as well as revealed. The story of Troy became a lesson in both the power and the peril of archaeology. As the century turned, new excavations refined the picture. Careful stratigraphy revealed 9 major layers of settlement at Hisarlik, from the early Bronze Age to the Roman era. Among them, Troy 6 and Troy 7 showed signs of destruction and rebuilding that might match the memory of Homer's war. The precise identity of Homer's Troy remained debated, but the essential fact was clear. Troy had been real. Its walls had stood, its gates had opened, its citadel had burned. What poetry had preserved in verse, archaeology had confirmed in stone. And so, by the dawn of the 20th century, a new confidence filled the field. If Troy could be found, then what else? If Homer could be tested against ruins, then could the Bible be tested against scrolls? Could the sacred stories of deserts and seas be weighed against archaeology, revealing what was history and what was myth? The rediscovery of Troy was more than a triumph of one man. It was the beginning of a new era in which myths worldwide would be examined under the light of excavation, their truths and fictions disentangled. The voices of the past were growing louder, and the next great whisper would not come from epic poetry but from fragile scrolls hidden in desert caves, waiting to be found by accident in a place no one expected. The rediscovery of Troy was more than an archaeological triumph. It was a cultural earthquake, shaking the foundations of how people thought about the past. For centuries, the Iliad had been revered as literature, its verses sung and studied for their beauty, not their factual truth. Now those verses were being tested against stone walls and layers of earth. The result was a strange blend of confirmation and contradiction, of certainty and doubt, and it forced humanity to confront an unsettling reality. The stories we inherit are neither pure invention nor pure record. They are mosaics, part memory, part imagination, part truth shaped into myth. For the public, the romance of Schliemann's work mattered more than its flaws. His golden treasures, his photographs of Sophia draped in ancient jewels, his bold declarations about Priam and Agamemnon all became symbols of an epic world resurrected. In truth, the artifacts belonged to earlier centuries, and the stratigraphy was muddled by careless excavation. But in the popular mind, such details faded. What mattered was that Homer's city had been found. That belief alone altered the way generations thought about history. Among scholars, the debates raged fiercely. Was Homer's Troy the 6th city at Hisarlik, with its grand fortifications, or the 7th, with signs of fire and siege? Were the Greeks of the Iliad Mycenaean warriors, armed with bronze swords and chariots? Or were they a poetic fusion of many ages? Could the gods, who strode so vividly across the verses, be explained as echoes of natural forces, cultural memory, or political allegory? Archaeology could not answer these questions directly, but it provided a framework in which they could be debated. Myth was no longer beyond the reach of evidence. This transformation was profound. For the first time, archaeology had shown that literature, even poetry wrapped in divine drama, could be tested against the earth itself. This was not the death of myth, but its rebirth, reshaped through evidence. Troy stood as a symbol of this new approach, a bridge between the dream world of poetry and the discipline of science. Schliemann himself did not live to see the full flowering of his discoveries. He died in 1890, leaving behind both admiration and controversy. Later archaeologists, including Wilhelm Dörpfeld and Carl Bliegen, refined his work, clarifying the layers of Troy and situating them within the broader history of the Bronze Age. Their findings revealed a city that had risen and fallen many times, part of a vibrant network of cultures stretching across the Aegean and Anatolia. In this broader picture, Troy was no longer just the backdrop of a single war. It was a center of trade, a stronghold of power, a city whose fate was bound to the shifting tides of an interconnected world. The rediscovery of Troy also changed the very spirit of archaeology. It showed that the field was not only about cataloging relics, but about challenging the boundary between belief and evidence. It taught scholars to approach ancient texts with both caution and respect, to recognize them as potential maps of memory. It also revealed the dangers of passion unchecked by method, for in the hands of a man driven more by vision than discipline, great treasures had been found, but also great knowledge lost. The story of Troy became a warning to future generations of archaeologists. The past is fragile, and once destroyed, it cannot be recovered. Yet the legacy of Troy was undeniable. It inspired new generations to look again at myths that had long been dismissed. If Troy was real, might other legends also be rooted in truth? Could the walls of Jericho still lie buried? Could the stories of lost scrolls or hidden temples be borne out by excavation? Archaeology, once confined to ruins of stone, began to expand its reach, probing deeper into the relationship between memory, faith, and material evidence. And so, the discovery of Troy did more than give walls to an epic. It gave archaeology a new mission. No longer was it enough to admire ruins or translate inscriptions. The task was now to test the great stories of humanity, to see whether their voices carried echoes of real places and real people. The field had matured, but it had also grown bold, willing to follow whispers into the dust. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, this boldness would lead to new frontiers. In deserts where shepherds tended their flocks, in caves where the air had not stirred for centuries, the past waited silently. Among scrolls hidden in clay jars, humanity would soon discover not only a trove of ancient writings, but a mirror reflecting its deepest beliefs. If Troy had shown that poetry could be tested, the next great revelation would show that even sacred texts were not beyond the reach of archaeology. The voices of gods and prophets, preserved in fragile ink upon parchment, lay waiting in darkness. And when they were found, they would shake the foundations of history, faith, and identity. In the spring of 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Ed-Dib wandered through the cliffs near the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. The sun beat down on the barren landscape, a place of stone and silence, where caves opened like dark mouths along the rock face. Searching for a lost goat, he tossed a stone into one of these caves. Instead of the hollow thud of rock against sand, he heard the unmistakable sound of breaking pottery. That single moment, a boy's idle gesture in the desert heat, would lead to one of the most extraordinary discoveries in the history of archaeology. The cave was not empty. Inside, stored in clay jars, were scrolls wrapped in linen, their surfaces cracked with age. The shepherds who first stumbled upon them could not have known the significance of what they had found. These were not mere scraps of parchment, but ancient texts that had lain undisturbed for nearly 2,000 years. They carried within them the voices of a community that had lived in the shadow of the desert during the final centuries before and after the birth of Christianity. In time, the world would know them as the Dead Sea Scrolls. At first, the scrolls passed quietly from the hands of the shepherds to local traders, sold in small portions for meager sums. Only gradually did scholars recognize what they truly were. Parchment fragments bearing Hebrew letters, words of prayers, laws, and prophecies, texts both familiar and strange. Soon, universities and museums scrambled to obtain them, and expeditions rushed to the caves of Qumran to search for more. The barren desert cliffs that had once been ignored became the center of global attention. The discoveries multiplied. Between 1947 and 1956, 11 caves near Qumran yielded scrolls and fragments numbering in the tens of thousands. Together they formed a vast library dating from the 3rd century before the Common Era to the 1st century of the Common Era. Some were copies of books already known from the Hebrew Bible, including Isaiah, Psalms, and Deuteronomy, written centuries earlier than any previously surviving manuscript. Others were unknown texts, unique to the community that had preserved them. There were rules for daily living, apocalyptic visions of the end of days, hymns of praise, and commentaries on scripture. The scrolls revealed a world of religious diversity, a world where belief was not singular but contested, argued, and passionately lived. What stunned scholars most was the age of the scrolls. Until their discovery, the earliest complete Hebrew manuscripts of the Bible dated to the medieval period, more than 1,000 years after the texts were first composed. The Dead Sea Scrolls pushed that timeline back by centuries, showing that the words of Scripture had been transmitted with remarkable fidelity across ages. Yet they also revealed differences, variations in wording and interpretation that showed the Bible was not a frozen monolith but a living tradition. This discovery shook both faith and scholarship. The community behind the scrolls was itself a subject of fascination. Archaeological excavations at Qumran revealed the remains of a settlement, communal dining halls, water channels, ritual baths and workshops. Scholars debated who had lived there. Many identified them as the Essenes, a Jewish sect described by writers like Josephus, who had withdrawn to the desert to pursue purity and await the coming of a messianic age. Others argued that the site had different functions, or that the scrolls had been placed in the caves by refugees fleeing Roman armies during the Jewish revolts. The debate remains unresolved, but the scrolls themselves testify to a group obsessed with discipline, prophecy, and the nearness of divine judgment. The impact of the Dead Sea Scrolls reached far beyond archaeology. For Jews and Christians alike, they opened a window onto the world of faith during the centuries when the Bible was taking its final form. The scrolls revealed that concepts central to Christianity, the expectation of a Messiah, the struggle between light and darkness, the hope for resurrection were already alive in Jewish thought before the birth of Jesus. This did not diminish Christianity, but rather placed it in a broader landscape of belief, showing how it emerged from currents already flowing in the ancient world. At the same time, the scrolls revealed the diversity of Judaism itself. They showed that in the Second Temple period, Judaism was not a single unified faith but a tapestry of competing visions. Some groups emphasized strict purity laws, others looked to temple rituals, others to mystical visions of angels and cosmic battles. The scrolls gave voice to a sectarian world filled with tension and hope, a world far more complex than the simplified narratives that later survived. And yet, beyond the debates and controversies, there was something profoundly moving about the scrolls themselves. To hold a fragment of Isaiah written 2,000 years ago, to see the careful strokes of ink placed by a scribe who believed he was preserving the words of God, was to collapse the distance of millennia. These were not just artifacts, they were living voices, fragile as parchment, carrying across centuries the devotion, fears, and longings of a people who sought to preserve truth in a world of turmoil. The discovery also highlighted how fragile history truly is. Had the shepherd not thrown his stone, had the jars not survived the centuries, the scrolls might have crumbled into dust unnoticed. An entire library, an entire voice of the past, could have been lost forever. It was a reminder that history often survives by chance, and that the earth still holds countless secrets waiting for their moment to emerge. The Dead Sea Scrolls were more than relics. They were revelations, showing that sacred texts were not only timeless but also deeply historical, shaped by communities, copied by human hands, preserved through faith and accident alike. They reminded the modern world that Scripture was not born in silence, but in the clash of ideas, the struggle of sects, the long labor of scribes writing by dim light. As word of the scrolls spread, so too did the questions. What did they mean for faith? What did they mean for the history of Judaism and Christianity? Could they challenge long-held beliefs, or would they confirm them? Scholars argued fiercely, theologians weighed carefully, and the public marveled at the idea that words written 2,000 years ago had returned to speak again. But for all their power, the scrolls were not the only voices the earth had preserved. For centuries, entire cities had slept beneath ash, frozen in the moment of their destruction. These places, unlike scrolls, did not speak through words on parchment, but through streets, kitchens, paintings, and even the shapes of bodies caught in disaster. If the Dead Sea Scrolls revealed the voices of belief, the ruins of Pompeii would reveal the daily breath of life itself. The scrolls that emerged from the caves of Qumran were more than ancient texts. They were sparks igniting storms of controversy. From the moment they were recognized as authentic, the The scholarly world and the wider public demanded to know what secrets they contained. Whispers spread through newspapers and pulpits alike. Did the scrolls reveal hidden teachings? Did they expose new origins for Christianity? Were they a threat to faith itself? The silence of the desert had broken, and what it spoke was unsettling. One of the greatest shocks was the closeness of the language and imagery of the scrolls to that of early Christianity. The scrolls spoke of a teacher of righteousness, a figure who suffered persecution and whose followers awaited divine vindication. They described a final war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, an apocalyptic struggle between good and evil that echoed the language of the Gospels and the Book of Revelation. They contained hymns that spoke of resurrection and the coming of a messianic figure who would redeem Israel. These parallels raised questions too bold to ignore. Had the writers of the scrolls influenced the earliest Christians? Was Jesus himself one among many voices in a world already filled with messianic hopes? Some scholars saw in the scrolls confirmation of Christianity's roots, showing that Jesus did not emerge in isolation, but within a vibrant, contested Jewish landscape. Others feared that the parallels would be used to reduce Christianity to one sect among many, stripping it of its uniqueness. Heated debates erupted in journals and conferences. Believers and skeptics alike pored over fragments, searching for lines that might tip the balance toward revelation or scandal. At the same time, the scrolls illuminated Judaism in the Second Temple period with a clarity never before possible. Until then, much of Jewish history in those centuries had been reconstructed from later texts, filtered through interpretation and survival. Now, here were the words of a community in their own time, their own hand. They revealed that Jewish society was deeply divided. Some groups, like the community at Qumran, emphasized ritual purity, withdrawing from the temple in Jerusalem, which they believed had been corrupted. Others emphasized sacrifice and priestly authority. Still, others looked for wisdom in mystical visions or apocalyptic prophecy. Far from being a monolithic faith, Judaism was a living argument, and the Dead Sea Scrolls gave us one of its loudest voices. The discovery also exposed the fragility of scholarship itself. At first, the scrolls were divided among a small circle of scholars who controlled access to them. Photographs and fragments were slow to be released, and suspicion grew. Rumors spread that damaging texts were being withheld, that secrets too dangerous for faith were locked away. Conspiracy theories flourished, claiming that the Vatican was suppressing documents that questioned Christianity. In truth, the delays were caused largely by the overwhelming task of piecing together thousands of tiny fragments, each requiring delicate preservation and careful interpretation. But the secrecy, intentional or not, cast a long shadow. It reminded the world that knowledge can be as political as it is historical. As fragments were gradually published, the reality proved both more complex and more fascinating than any conspiracy. The scrolls did not reveal a hidden gospel or a lost book of Jesus, but they did show the atmosphere of expectation into which Christianity was born. They revealed a world obsessed with the end of days, with purity and corruption, with messiahs and divine intervention. The teachings of Jesus were radical, but they resonated within currents already flowing through Jewish thought. Christianity was not born in a vacuum. It was the child of a restless and divided age. The impact of this realization was immense. For Judaism, the scrolls offered a direct link to ancestors who had sought holiness in the desert, who had debated law, ritual, and prophecy with intensity. For Christianity, they showed that its earliest teachings were part of a broader chorus, one voice among many, waiting for God's kingdom. For secular historians, they were evidence that religion itself was shaped by history, that sacred texts were not untouched by human context but deeply embedded within it. The scrolls also transformed the methods of archaeology. Suddenly, fragile materials like parchment and papyrus, long thought too perishable to survive, became central. Preservation techniques advanced, with scientists developing new ways to stabilize ink and reconstruct damaged fragments. The Dead Sea Scrolls taught archaeology that words could be as valuable as stones, that libraries could lie hidden in caves as powerfully as cities could sleep beneath soil. Yet, for all their revelations, the scrolls remained elusive. Thousands of fragments had to be pieced together like puzzles with missing parts. Many scrolls were incomplete, their words broken by holes and tears. Scholars spent decades reconstructing lines from scraps no larger than a coin. Even today, debates continue over their interpretation. Who exactly was the teacher of righteousness? Was the community truly Essene, or another group altogether? Were the scrolls hidden before the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 of the Common Era, or earlier? Each answer spawned new questions, ensuring that the scrolls remain a living field of inquiry. And behind all the debates lingered a deeper truth. The scrolls were voices of a people who had vanished, their world destroyed by war, their community scattered. Their prayers, their laws, their visions survived only because they had hidden them in jars, sealed in caves, waiting for a future that would not come until millennia later. To read them is to touch the hopes and fears of human beings whose lives were cut short, but whose words endured. As the 20th century unfolded, the Dead Sea Scrolls captured the imagination not only of scholars and believers, but of the entire world. They appeared in newspapers, novels, and films, inspiring both reverence and speculation. They reminded humanity that faith is historical, that scriptures are human as well as divine, and that history is always more complex than legend. But while the scrolls revealed the inner world of belief, another discovery would reveal something different. In a city buried beneath volcanic ash, time itself had stopped. There, the ruins did not speak through parchment or prophecy, but through streets and houses, meals left unfinished, and bodies frozen in their final breath. The Dead Sea Scrolls showed us how a people believed. Pompeii would show us how a people lived. The decades after the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls were filled with as much drama as the texts themselves. Scholars worked painstakingly in dimly lit rooms, piecing together fragments of parchment like detectives, reconstructing the shattered pieces of a crime scene. Thousands of scraps were matched by handwriting, by ink, by style, by faint patterns invisible to the naked eye. The work was endless, but the promise was irresistible. Each fragment restored was another voice returned to history, another sentence pulled from silence. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, new technologies brought fresh clarity. Infrared photography revealed writing invisible to the eye, strokes of ink faded by centuries of decay. Digital imaging stitched fragments together virtually, allowing scholars to see connections that had been overlooked. DNA testing of parchment identified which animal skins the scrolls had been made from, hinting at the organization of scribal workshops. Artificial intelligence began to compare handwriting, revealing that some scrolls once thought to be written by a single scribe were in fact the work of many. Slowly, the Library of Qumran was being reborn, not only through human patience, but through the precision of science. The scrolls also transformed the public understanding of sacred texts. They showed that what many had considered fixed and unchanging had in fact passed through centuries of copying, editing, and debate. Variations in wording revealed that scripture had lived in many forms before reaching its final canon. For some believers, this realization deepened faith, showing that divine truth could endure even through human imperfection. For others, it was unsettling, a reminder that no text falls from the heavens untouched by human hands. The scrolls forced both scholars and believers to grapple with a fundamental truth. The sacred is also historical. The controversies that once surrounded access to the scrolls eventually gave way to openness. High-resolution images were published online, allowing anyone with an internet connection to study them. What had once been guarded by a small circle of scholars became a treasure shared with the world. For the first time, humanity at large could see the ink strokes of scribes who had lived 2 millennia ago, who had dipped their reeds into ink and written words they believed would carry across eternity. But beyond scholarship and faith, the scrolls carry an emotional power that no academic debate can erase. Imagine the hands of the young Bedouin shepherd throwing a stone into a cave, and by chance striking a jar that had waited in silence for 2,000 years. Imagine the scribe who had rolled that scroll, sealed it, and hidden it away as armies marched across Judea. Neither could have imagined the other. Yet across that gulf of centuries, their lives touched. History is built not only on monuments, but on accidents, on fragile lines of chance that preserve what might otherwise be lost forever. The Dead Sea Scrolls also remind us that history does not always survive in the grand palaces of kings or the massive temples of empires. Sometimes it survives in the margins, among small communities, in caves far from the centers of power. The community of Qumran may never have conquered cities or commanded armies, but their words outlasted empires. They remind us that history is not only the story of the powerful, it is also the story of those who lived on the edges, who preserved their faith in the face of destruction, whose voices waited in silence until the modern age was ready to hear them. In this sense, the scrolls are not only archaeological artifacts, they are a mirror. They show us how people wrestled with hope, with fear, with the question of meaning in a world that seemed on the brink of collapse. They reveal that the human longing for truth, justice, and divine order is as old as history itself. In the prayers, laws, and visions of the scrolls, we hear echoes of our own questions, our own search for certainty in an uncertain world. As the 20th century closed and the 21st began, the Dead Sea Scrolls stood as one of the defining discoveries of modern archaeology. They were not treasure in the sense of gold or jewels. They were treasure in the sense of memory, knowledge, and connection. They reminded humanity that words can survive as powerfully as stone, that libraries can be hidden in caves as enduringly as cities can lie beneath ash. They showed that the past is never static but alive, always ready to challenge the present. And yet, for all their power, the scrolls were only part of the story of discovery. For while they gave us the inner world of belief, another site would give us the outer world of daily life. If the Dead Sea Scrolls revealed how a people prayed, Pompeii would reveal how a people cooked, laughed, painted, loved, and died. If the scrolls showed us the soul, Pompeii would show us the body. In the year 79 of the Common Era, Mount Vesuvius erupted, burying an entire city beneath a flood of ash and pumice. For nearly 2,000 years that city slept, perfectly preserved, waiting to tell its story. Where the scrolls had whispered in faded ink, Pompeii would speak in murals, streets, and human forms frozen in time. Together, they would show that the past is not only about what people believed, but about how they lived. On a summer morning, in the year 79 of the Common Era, the people of Pompeii woke to the rhythms of ordinary life. Merchants set out their wares in the marketplace. Bakers lit their ovens, the scent of bread rising into the streets. Children chased each other along narrow alleys, while farmers from the countryside drove carts loaded with produce toward the gates. Above the city loomed Mount Vesuvius, a presence so familiar that its danger was forgotten. The volcano had slept for centuries. To the citizens of Pompeii, it was simply part of the horizon. Yet beneath its slopes, pressure was building, a fire ready to burst forth. Before the day was done, an entire world would vanish, swallowed not by myth or war, but by nature itself. The eruption came with terrifying speed. First, tremors shook the ground, sending panic through the streets. Then, with a roar that seemed to tear the heavens open, Vesuvius released a column of ash, gas, and fire that soared miles into the sky. Stones and pumice rained down upon the city. Roofs collapsed under the weight. People fled through streets already choked with debris, clutching children, treasures, and animals in desperate flight. For hours, the eruption continued, turning day into night. At last, waves of superheated gas and ash, known as pyroclastic flows, raced down the slopes, engulfing Pompeii and its sister city Herculaneum. Within moments, thousands were dead. Within hours, both cities were buried, entombed beneath meters of volcanic debris. For nearly 17 centuries, Pompeii remained hidden. Villagers living nearby knew of ruins buried under their fields, sometimes uncovering marble or statues while digging wells. But the city itself lay forgotten. Only in 1693, during the construction of a canal, were portions of Herculaneum discovered. Systematic excavation of Pompeii began in 1748, under the direction of the Bourbon kings of Naples. At first, it was little more than treasure hunting. Statues, mosaics, and frescoes were removed and placed in palaces. The city itself was left half-covered, its context ignored. But as decades passed, the true significance of Pompeii began to emerge. This was not a collection of scattered ruins. This was an entire Roman city, preserved not as legend or ruin, but as it had been on the very day it died. The uniqueness of Pompeii lay not only in what was found, but in how it was preserved. Unlike most archaeological sites, where centuries of rebuilding blur the past, Pompeii was frozen in an instant. Ash and pumice sealed its streets, its houses, its shops. Walls retained their frescoes, floors their mosaics, kitchens their tools, even loaves of bread carbonized in ovens. Amphorae still lined taverns, ready to be filled with wine. Graffiti scratched into walls revealed jokes, love notes, and political slogans. The city was not only architecture, it was life, caught in the act of being lived. Perhaps the most haunting discoveries were the people themselves. As excavators dug through hardened ash, they found voids in the shape of human bodies, spaces left where flesh had decayed, but the surrounding ash had held its form. By carefully pouring plaster into these cavities, archaeologists revealed the final moments of Pompeii's citizens. Mothers curled around children, dogs twisted in chains, men covered their faces as if to shield themselves from the suffocating ash. These plaster casts became windows into the last breath of an ancient world, capturing in silence the fear, love, and humanity of people 2,000 years gone. The rediscovery of Pompeii changed more than archaeology. It changed imagination. In the 18th century, when Europe was enthralled by classical ideals, Pompeii offered something no poem or statue could. It offered reality. To walk its streets was to step into the ancient world not as myth or reconstruction, but as lived space. Here were taverns where Romans had drunk, brothels where frescoes still adorned the walls, gardens where fountains had once played. Here were theaters where crowds had cheered, amphitheaters where gladiators had fought. The city was not distant. It was immediate, familiar, unnervingly alive. Writers, artists, and philosophers flocked to Pompeii. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, visiting in 1787, declared that no tragedy of the stage could compare to the silent streets of the city buried in fire. Painters recreated scenes of eruption and ruin, while novels imagined the lives of Pompeii's citizens on the eve of destruction. In the 19th century, Edward Bulwer Lytton's novel, The Last Days of Pompeii, captivated readers, mixing romance and doom against the backdrop of the eruption. Pompeii became more than a site. It became a symbol of fragility, of how quickly life can be overturned by forces beyond control. For archaeologists, Pompeii became a laboratory. Unlike most sites where fragments had to be pieced together with imagination, here the evidence was abundant and direct. Streets revealed the city's layout, houses revealed social hierarchies, graffiti revealed the voices of common people. The smallest details, the arrangement of a dining couch, the placement of amphorae in a shop, revealed patterns of daily life. Pompeii turned archaeology from the study of monuments into the study of societies. It shifted focus from kings and generals to bakers, weavers, and children. It gave history a human face. Yet the very abundance of Pompeii also carried challenges. As excavation expanded, so too did the question of preservation. Frescoes exposed to sunlight faded, walls crumbled, and looters carried off treasures. The very act of uncovering Pompeii risked destroying what had survived for centuries. Archaeologists faced a paradox. To reveal the city was to endanger it. To leave it buried was to deny the world its insight. To this day, much of Pompeii remains unexcavated, left beneath ash as a safeguard against time. But for all its fragility, Pompeii continues to speak. Its streets are a reminder that history is not only the story of kings and battles, it is the story of ordinary lives, lived in laughter and labor, cut short by disaster. The plaster casts, with their frozen gestures, remind us that archaeology is not only about objects, but about people, about the humanity that unites us across centuries. As the 19th century turned to the 20th, Pompeii stood as one of the most visited and studied sites in the world. Tourists walked its streets, scholars mapped its ruins, artists drew inspiration from its tragic beauty. The city buried in ash had become immortal, not in the way its citizens had hoped, but in a way more powerful still. It had become a mirror, showing every generation how fragile and precious life truly is. And yet, as haunting as Pompeii was, it was only one revelation among many. For archaeology was not finished with its surprises. The further scholars dug into time, the further back history seemed to stretch. Pompeii showed us the first century of Rome. But soon, a discovery in the hills of Turkey would reveal something even more astonishing, a site older than cities themselves, older than agriculture, older even than the idea of civilization. It would show that the urge to worship and build monuments did not wait for farming or kings. It began with humanity itself. Pompeii's greatest gift to history was not its tragedy, but its intimacy. To walk its stone streets is to step into a world caught in the midst of ordinary days, a city stopped, not at the height of ceremony, but in the very fabric of routine. Unlike ruined temples or fragmentary texts, Pompeii does not require imagination to fill its silence. It speaks in details so immediate that they collapse the gulf of centuries. The baker's shop tells the story as clearly as any epic. Round loaves of bread, carbonized but intact, were found still in the ovens, stamped with the seals of their makers. The mills where grain had been ground stand beside them, their stones worn smooth by years of labor. Amphorae lined the walls, ready for trade. These were not symbols, but lives, the rhythm of work, the bustle of business, the hunger of a city feeding itself. In the plaster casts of dogs curled against chains, in the skeletons of horses still tethered to their stalls, the city reveals not only human labor but the bond of animals who shared its fate. The houses tell another layer of the story. In grand villas, walls gleam with frescoes depicting gods, landscapes, and mythic scenes. Floors shine with intricate mosaics, some so fine they resemble painted canvases. Courtyards open to the sun, surrounded by columns, with fountains bubbling into pools. These were the homes of Pompeii's wealthy merchants and magistrates who lived in splendor. Yet just beyond, smaller dwellings cluster, simple rooms crowded together, their walls bare, their furniture modest. The contrast is stark, revealing a city divided by wealth and class, where opulence and poverty lived side by side. Even more revealing are the messages scrawled across Pompeii's walls. Graffiti in charcoal, or scratched into plaster, preserves the voices of people otherwise lost to history. There are declarations of love, insults, jokes, political slogans, urging citizens to support one candidate or another. One wall bears a crude drawing of a gladiator with his name written proudly beside it, a fan's tribute to his hero. Another records a tally of debts. In these scribbles, the ancients are no longer distant. They are as alive as any crowd today, laughing, arguing, and mocking one another in the margins of daily life. The brothels of Pompeii provide yet another perspective, their walls adorned with frescoes depicting acts too explicit for many later visitors to endure. For centuries, these images were hidden from public view, locked away in museum vaults or restricted collections. Yet they reveal the frankness with which Romans approached sexuality and the central place of such establishments in urban life. The world of Pompeii was not one of idealized statues and noble speeches alone. It was earthy, bawdy, and unashamed. The theaters and amphitheaters of Pompeii remind us of its pleasures. The large theater could hold thousands, staging plays and musical performances. The smaller Odeon hosted more intimate gatherings. The amphitheater, one of the earliest of its kind, echoed with the roars of crowds cheering gladiators. In the plaster casts of bodies found near these public spaces, we glimpse not only the tragedy of death but the echoes of voices that once cheered, debated, and sang. Pompeii also testifies to the interconnectedness of the ancient world. Amphorae, stamped with inscriptions, show that wine and oil were imported from distant provinces. Exotic spices, jewelry, and artworks speak of trade routes stretching across the Mediterranean. The people of Pompeii lived not in isolation but in a globalized Roman world, part of an empire that spanned continents. The eruption froze this network in time, capturing the crossroads of cultures that had gathered in one bustling city. The haunting detail of the plaster casts remains one of the most powerful legacies. To stand before the figure of a man curled on the ground, arms raised to shield his face, or of a mother clutching her child, is to feel history as something visceral. These are not nameless ruins. They are people. Their gestures are universal, recognizable across time. Fear, love, and desperation transcend centuries. Archaeology rarely allows such intimacy. Yet in Pompeii, death preserved humanity itself. The rediscovery of the city shaped not only archaeology but also art and philosophy. In the Enlightenment, Pompeii fed the hunger for antiquity, inspiring painters, architects, and writers. In the Romantic Age, it became a symbol of fleeting life, a reminder that beauty and civilization can vanish in an instant. Poets wrote of its silent streets as metaphors for human mortality. Novelists imagined its citizens' final moments, blurring history and fiction. Even in the modern age, Pompeii remains a symbol of fragility, appearing in films, novels, and exhibitions as a city forever caught between life and death. Yet Pompeii is not simply about destruction, it is also about survival. Against all odds, walls still stand, frescoes still glow, voices still whisper from graffiti. The eruption that killed the city also preserved it, sealing it in a tomb of ash. What seemed like catastrophe became a strange kind of immortality. Pompeii's citizens could not have known that their tragedy would one day make them eternal. But the excavation of Pompeii also posed new ethical questions. How much of a city should be uncovered? Each building revealed to sunlight risks deterioration. Each fresco exposed begins to fade. Should we preserve what remains buried, or reveal it for knowledge and memory? Archaeologists wrestle with this question still, balancing the hunger for discovery with the duty of protection. The lessons of Pompeii go beyond archaeology. They remind us of nature's power, of the thin line between life and death, of the fragility of civilization. They remind us that history is not abstract, not distant. It is made of lives, lived in laughter and labor, in hope and despair, and it can vanish in a single day. Yet Pompeii also taught archaeology to look differently at ruins. It shifted attention from kings and temples to the ordinary people whose lives truly form history. It humanized the ancient world, making it less about statues and more about streets, and it prepared scholars for an even greater shift. For while Pompeii revealed the daily world of the first century, another discovery would reach far deeper, rewriting the very origins of civilization itself. In the hills of southeastern Turkey, stones older than farming, older than cities, older even than writing itself, would reveal that humanity's first impulse was not to build houses or plant crops, but to raise temples toward the sky. Pompeii was more than a ruin, more than a tomb. It was a paradox. It was a city destroyed in a single day, yet preserved for millennia. It was a tragedy that killed thousands, yet gave them a kind of immortality that few in history achieve. For archaeologists, it was both a gift and a burden. Every street, every wall, every cast demanded attention, interpretation, and care. And yet, the more of the city that was uncovered, the more fragile it became, crumbling under the weight of time and exposure. To uncover Pompeii was to risk losing it. In the 19th and 20th centuries, waves of excavation opened vast portions of the city. Villas, shops, and temples emerged from the ash. Streets filled with paving stones stretched in orderly grids, ruts from ancient carts still carved into their surfaces. Visitors could walk the same roads once tread by Roman sandals. Yet each new revelation raised questions. How much was enough? Should the entire city be unearthed, or should parts be left buried for future generations, who might possess technologies we lack to preserve them better? Even now, nearly a third of Pompeii remains covered, sealed beneath layers of volcanic debris, waiting like a time capsule for another age. The story of Pompeii also reshaped the role of archaeology in the modern world. It was one of the first discoveries to capture the attention not only of scholars but of the public at large. Crowds came to walk the ancient streets, to peer into the plaster forms of the dead, to marvel at frescoes still glowing with color. The site became a tourist destination long before the word had modern meaning, shaping how people thought about the past. Archaeology was no longer confined to scholars in study rooms. It had become a spectacle, a shared cultural memory, a story told across nations. But Pompeii also gave archaeology something deeper: perspective. For centuries, history had been written by the victors, by kings and generals, by monuments carved to proclaim glory. Pompeii revealed something else. It showed the value of the ordinary, of lives that left no inscriptions, of laughter scribbled on walls, of meals half-eaten. It gave history a human face, reminding us that the great empires of Rome were built not only on the decrees of emperors, but on the work of bakers, farmers, and children playing in courtyards. It is in Pompeii, more than in any marble statue, that the heartbeat of Rome still lingers. The plaster casts of the victims remain the most haunting legacy. Each one tells a story without words. A man lies face down, hands over his head, as if bracing against a sky that collapsed upon him. A woman holds a child tightly, their forms forever fused in desperation. A dog, twisted against its chain, reminds us of the cruelty of fate that spares none. These shapes are not distant relics, they are mirrors. In their postures we see ourselves, caught in moments of fear, of love, of struggle against forces beyond our control. Few discoveries in all of archaeology bring the past so close. Few remind us so powerfully that the ancients were not abstractions but people. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius was a natural disaster, but its preservation of Pompeii was also a gift. Without it, the details of Roman daily life would be shadows at best. With it, they became vivid. Pompeii shows us what ruins often cannot: the color of walls, the flavor of meals, the rhythm of streets. It shows us that history is not only what is written, but what is lived. The lessons of Pompeii extend beyond archaeology. They remind us of impermanence. They remind us that civilizations, however powerful, are vulnerable to forces of nature. They remind us that lives, however ordinary, can become immortal through the accidents of preservation. They remind us that history is fragile, that every ruin uncovered is a voice pulled from silence, and that once lost, such voices cannot be restored. By the mid-20th century, Pompeii had become one of the most studied sites in the world, yet its significance lies not only in what it revealed about Rome, but in what it revealed about archaeology itself. It shifted focus from monuments to people, from power to daily life, from myth to reality. It taught that the past can survive in astonishing ways, but also that it must be handled with care. And then, just as Pompeii taught us about the daily rhythms of Rome, another discovery would challenge the very origins of civilization itself. For what if the urge to build temples came not after farming, but before it? What if the first true monuments were not houses or walls, but sanctuaries for gods? In the hills of southeastern Turkey, a site older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older even than the first settled villages, would force scholars to rewrite the timeline of humanity. It would suggest that before we planted seeds in the ground, we were already reaching for the heavens. Pompeii had shown us how civilization lived and died in a single day. Göbekli Tepe would show us that civilization itself was far older, stranger, and more mysterious than we had ever dared to believe. On a dusty hilltop in southeastern Turkey, near the ancient city of Urfa, lies a mound that for centuries seemed no different from the countless others scattered across the region. Farmers ploughed its slopes, shepherds led their flocks across it, stones weathered by time jutted from the earth like broken teeth. Locals called it Potbelly Hill Göbekli Tepe. For generations, it was little more than a feature of the landscape. No one suspected that beneath its soil lay a secret older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids of Egypt, older even than the first villages. What lay buried there would force archaeologists to rewrite the very origins of civilization. In 1963, a joint survey by Turkish and American archaeologists noted the presence of ancient flints and fragments at Göbekli Tepe, but the site was not immediately recognized for its significance. It was not until 1994, when the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavations, that the true magnitude of the discovery became clear. Beneath the soil emerged massive stone pillars arranged in circles, each weighing many tons, some reaching over 5 meters in height. Carved into their surfaces were intricate reliefs of animals, lions, scorpions, foxes, vultures, and snakes. These were not natural outcrops, they were megaliths, purposefully shaped and arranged. What shocked Schmidt and the world was their age. Radiocarbon dating revealed that Göbekli Tepe was built around 12,000 years ago, at the very dawn of the Holocene. This date shattered everything archaeologists thought they knew about human history. For decades, the dominant theory had been that religion and monumental architecture arose only after the Neolithic Revolution, when humans settled into farming communities around 10,000 years ago. Agriculture, it was thought, provided the surplus food and organized labor needed to build temples and monuments. But Göbekli Tepe turned this sequence upside down. Here, long before farming, hunter-gatherers had gathered to erect massive stone circles, not as dwellings, but as sanctuaries. Religion had not followed civilization, religion had built it. The site itself is staggering in scale and complexity. Dozens of stone circles, many still buried, cover the mound. At their centers stand two towering T-shaped pillars, thought to represent anthropomorphic beings. Some are carved with stylized arms and belts, suggesting that the pillars themselves may have been envisioned as gods or ancestors. Around them, the walls and pillars are decorated with animals, often in dynamic poses, snarling, hunting, or in flight. The artistry is vivid, the symbolism profound. This was not the work of scattered nomads. It was the expression of a society capable of organizing labor, transmitting knowledge, and sustaining ritual on a monumental scale. The implications are immense. Göbekli Tepe suggests that the impulse to worship, to gather around symbols and sanctuaries, predates the domestication of plants and animals. It suggests that religion was not a byproduct of farming, but a driving force behind it. People may have come together to build temples, and only afterward discovered that farming was necessary to support such gatherings. Civilization, in this view, was born not from the seed but from the stone, not from necessity but from meaning. Schmidt himself described Göbekli Tepe as humanity's first cathedral on a hill. It was not a settlement. There are no houses, no signs of daily living. It was a place apart, a sanctuary where hunter-gatherers returned again and again to perform rituals, perhaps to honor ancestors, to commune with gods, or to bind their communities through shared belief. When the structures fell out of use, they were deliberately buried, sealed beneath earth, as if the people who built them wished to preserve them for eternity or to conceal their power. This deliberate burial preserved the site, keeping its carvings sharp and its pillars upright across millennia. The discovery challenged not only archaeology, but philosophy. For centuries, humanity had believed that culture and spirituality were luxuries born of stability, but Göbekli Tepe whispered a different story. It suggested that meaning came first, that the hunger for transcendence drove people to gather, to organize, and eventually to farm. It suggested that the sacred impulse is as primal as hunger, as enduring as survival itself. And the mystery deepens. Who were the people who built Göbekli Tepe? Their names are lost, their languages are unknown, they left no writing, only stones. Yet the skill with which they carved, transported, and raised these megaliths suggests a knowledge far beyond what hunter-gatherers were believed to possess. How did they move stones weighing 10 to 20 tons without beasts of burden or wheels? How did they organize hundreds of people to labor on a hilltop when they lived by hunting and foraging? Each answer only multiplies the questions. Göbekli Tepe stands at the edge of myth. It blurs the line between archaeology and imagination. It is a place where vultures carry severed heads carved in stone, where animals dance in endless procession, where faceless giants of limestone tower over circles of worshippers long vanished. It is both a temple and a riddle. And yet, its very existence forces us to rethink the story of humanity. Civilization was not a straight line from farms to villages to temples. It was something stranger. It may have begun in ritual gatherings around stones, in shared visions of gods or ancestors, in ceremonies that bound scattered bands into something larger. If so, then Göbekli Tepe is not just a ruin. It is the birthplace of civilization itself. The discovery left scholars both exhilarated and uneasy. For every explanation proposed, another mystery appeared. Was Göbekli Tepe a site of shamanic visions, a sanctuary of ancestor worship, or a stage for rituals of death and rebirth? Was it a gathering place for tribes spread across the Fertile Crescent, or the heart of a single community that sought to touch eternity? We may never know for certain. But the stones remain, carved with animals that still seem to move in the shifting light, pillars that still seem to guard secrets too vast for words. Pompeii had shown us how fragile life can be, stopped in a single day. Göbekli Tepe shows us something even more profound, that the human search for meaning is older than cities, older than farming, older than history itself. It tells us that before we wrote words, we carved symbols. Before we built homes, we built sanctuaries. Before we planted fields, we planted faith. When archaeologists first cleared the dust from Göbekli Tepe's pillars, they realized that the carvings upon them were more than decoration. Each figure seemed to belong to a hidden language of symbols. Vultures, foxes, scorpions, snakes, lions, boars, and wild asses all danced across the stone, locked in poses that spoke of fear, fertility, danger, and transcendence. Some panels showed predators circling prey. Others displayed headless human figures or abstract signs that resisted interpretation. It was as though the builders of Göbekli Tepe had etched their worldview directly into stone, a worldview in which the boundary between life and death, human and animal, sacred and natural, was fluid and alive. The presence of vultures, in particular, sparked fascination. In ancient Anatolia and Mesopotamia, vultures were often associated with death rituals, with the exposure of bodies to the sky, where birds of prey carried the flesh of the dead to the heavens. At Göbekli Tepe, scenes of vultures alongside headless humans suggest ceremonies of excarnation, rituals in which death was not the end but a passage. The stones seem to whisper of a world where humans lived not apart from nature but within it, bound in cycles of birth, decay, and transcendence. The T-shaped pillars at the center of each circle deepened the mystery. Their flat tops and elongated shafts made them look like giant stone beings, faceless yet undeniably anthropomorphic. Some bore carvings of arms, hands, and belts, suggesting they represented stylized humans, perhaps ancestors, perhaps deities, perhaps guardians of the sacred space. To stand within the circle, surrounded by these towering forms, must have been to feel small, enclosed within the presence of giants who embodied powers greater than any individual. The architecture of Göbekli Tepe is equally astonishing. To quarry, carve, and raise pillars weighing 10 to 20 tons would have required extraordinary coordination. Without wheels, without beasts of burden, without metal tools, these people organized and executed feats of engineering that rival much later civilizations. The circles were carefully planned, aligned, and constructed with precision. This was not haphazard building. It was intentional, communal, and monumental. What drove hunter-gatherers to such effort? The prevailing theory is that ritual itself was the answer. By gathering at Göbekli Tepe, scattered bands of people forged bonds that transcended tribe and kinship. Shared ceremonies created shared identity, and shared identity demanded permanence. The pillars, then, were not merely stones, they were anchors of community, tangible expressions of unity and belief. In this sense, Göbekli Tepe was not only a temple, it was a catalyst for the creation of society itself. This inversion of the old narrative that religion preceded agriculture is profound. Traditionally, scholars believed that once humans learned to farm, surplus food allowed them to gather in large groups, to support priests, and to build temples. Göbekli Tepe suggests the opposite, that the desire to gather and perform rituals drove people to create systems of food production to sustain themselves. In other words, farming may have been invented not for survival alone but for worship. Civilization was born not in the field but at the altar. The deliberate burial of the site adds another layer of mystery. After centuries of use, the circles of Göbekli Tepe were carefully filled with debris, layer by layer, as though the builders wished to seal them forever. Why? Was it an act of reverence, a way of retiring sacred spaces that had served their purpose? Or was it fear, a desire to close something too powerful, too dangerous, to leave exposed? Whatever the reason, this burial preserved the site for 12,000 years, a time capsule of humanity's earliest monuments. For modern archaeology, Göbekli Tepe was both a revelation and a challenge. It forced scholars to admit that the neat timeline of progress from hunting to farming to cities to temples was an illusion. Human history was far messier, driven by forces of meaning and belief as much as by survival and technology. It showed that culture is not a byproduct of necessity but a force in its own right, capable of reshaping the very foundations of society. The site also awakened imaginations far beyond academic circles. Some saw in its stones echoes of lost civilizations, suggesting that forgotten knowledge had guided its construction. Others speculated about astronomical alignments, proposing that the pillars were arranged to mark stars, solstices, or even comets that blazed in the ancient sky. While some of these claims remain speculative, they reflect the power of Göbekli Tepe to stir wonder. Like Stonehenge or the pyramids, it has become more than archaeology. It has become myth reborn. Yet amid all the mystery, Göbekli Tepe tells us something deeply human. It shows us that long before kings and empires, people were gathering to make meaning, to face the mysteries of life and death together. It shows us that the desire to transcend, to reach beyond survival, is not an invention of modern religion, but a thread woven into the fabric of humanity itself. The stones stand as testimony that to be human is not only to eat and drink, but to worship, to imagine, to create symbols that outlive us. Standing among those pillars today, visitors feel the same awe that must have seized the builders 12,000 years ago. The stones loom not as ruins but as presences, silent yet eloquent, whispering of rituals lost to time. They remind us that the search for meaning is older than history, older than writing, older than the very fields that sustain us. In their shadows, the line between archaeology and myth dissolves, leaving only the undeniable truth that humanity has always been more than survival. Pompeii had shown us life arrested in an instant. Göbekli Tepe shows us something even more unsettling. It shows us that the roots of civilization are far deeper and far stranger than we ever imagined. As the stones of Göbekli Tepe rose from the earth, they did more than challenge archaeology. They challenged identity. For centuries, humanity had told itself a simple story, that we were once wanderers, then farmers, then builders of cities, then worshippers of gods. Göbekli Tepe shattered that order. It told us that the sacred impulse came first, that before we learned to sow grain, we had already sown meaning into stone. Civilization, it seemed, was born not out of necessity but out of imagination. This realization has profound consequences. If shared rituals were the glue that bound people together, then community itself was born in worship. Farming, writing, and kingship followed not as the origins of civilization, but as its supports, its later structures. The first spark was belief, a collective vision so strong that it could move stones weighing 20 tons, so urgent that it could gather hundreds of people without palaces, laws, or armies to command them. In the shadow of Göbekli Tepe, we are forced to see ourselves differently. We are not only tool makers, hunters, and farmers. We are meaning makers, creatures who dream and then carve those dreams into the world. The site also raises questions about what knowledge has been lost. 12,000 years is an abyss of time, longer than all recorded history put together. What other sanctuaries, what other symbols, once stood on hills now eroded, in valleys now buried, in plains now drowned beneath seas? If Göbekli Tepe could sleep in silence for millennia, waiting to be found, how much of humanity's early story remains hidden, its whispers unheard? Archaeology, for all its triumphs, has only brushed the surface of that silence. Even now, Göbekli Tepe is not fully uncovered. Much of the mound remains sealed, its circles and pillars buried. Klaus Schmidt, the archaeologist who dedicated his life to the site, believed that what had been revealed was only a fraction of what lay beneath. He called Göbekli Tepe not the last discovery, but the first chapter of an entirely new understanding of human origins. His sudden death in 2014 left questions unanswered, but the stones remain, waiting for the next generation to continue the work. And as excavations continue, new technologies bring the site into sharper focus. Ground-penetrating radar suggests more circles still hidden under the soil. Digital scans reconstruct carvings too faint for the eye to see. Artificial intelligence begins to map patterns in the symbols, searching for grammar in the silent language of stone. Each discovery pushes the mystery deeper, reminding us that the past is not static but alive, changing with each tool we use to read it. Göbekli Tepe also connects us to a truth both humbling and inspiring. The people who carved these pillars had no metal tools, no writing, no wheels, no beasts of burden. They lived by hunting and foraging, vulnerable to hunger and weather. And yet, they raised monuments that endured for 12,000 years. Our skyscrapers may crumble in a few centuries. Our digital records may vanish in decades. But their stones still stand, silent guardians of humanity's first vision of the sacred. What drove them? We may never fully know. Perhaps they gathered in fear of the unknown, seeking protection from forces they could not control. Perhaps they gathered in awe, celebrating life, death, and renewal in rituals now lost. Perhaps both. What we can say with certainty is that they gathered, and in gathering, they created civilization. Göbekli Tepe is not only archaeology, it is a reminder that the line between survival and meaning is thin, and that the urge to reach beyond ourselves is as ancient as the human race. It tells us that the need for the sacred is not an afterthought of progress, but its beginning. It tells us that before cities, before kings, before nations, there were circles of stone where people stood together, looking up at the stars, asking questions that still haunt us today. And it reminds us of something else, that history is not finished. For if Göbekli Tepe lay hidden for 12,000 years, what else lies buried? Already, sonar and satellites reveal structures beneath jungles and deserts, and the ocean floor hints at ruins swallowed by rising seas. Just as Göbekli Tepe overturned our sense of beginnings, discoveries beneath the waters may overturn our sense of continuity, showing us civilizations drowned by time. Pompeii showed us how a city could be preserved by disaster. Göbekli Tepe showed us that civilization began not with farming but with faith. The next frontier lies beneath the oceans, where sunken temples and cities may yet rise again from the deep. Humanity's story is not a straight line, but a labyrinth, with corridors still unopened, with chambers still waiting to speak. In the spring of 1900, a group of Greek sponge divers set out into the waters of the Aegean Sea near the island of Antikythera. The sea there is deep and treacherous, swept by strong currents, but it is also rich in wrecks. One of the divers, Elias Stadiatis, descended into the gloom wearing a heavy bronze diving helmet and weighted boots. At a depth of nearly 50 meters, he expected to see coral or sponges swaying in the current. Instead, he saw the ghost of a ship sprawled across the seabed, its timbers long rotted, its cargo strewn among boulders. When he surfaced, pale and shaken, he described the site not as treasure but as a cemetery. The wreck contained statues, broken pieces of bronze and marble, arms and torsos of gods and athletes lying silently on the ocean floor. The ship was ancient, dating to the 1st century before the Common Era, a Roman-era vessel that had carried luxury goods from the eastern Mediterranean to Italy. Salvage operations began, and soon divers brought up magnificent bronze statues, marble figures, amphorae, and coins. These finds dazzled museums, but amid the cargo was an unassuming object that at first drew little attention. It was a corroded lump of bronze, broken into fragments, encrusted with centuries of sea growth. Only later, when conservators examined it more closely, did they realize that this humble lump concealed gears, dials, and inscriptions unlike anything ever seen from antiquity. The fragments, pieced together over decades, revealed the existence of a device so sophisticated that it stunned the modern world. Known today as the Antikythera mechanism, it was an ancient analog computer, built with precision gears and designed to track the movements of the sun, moon, and planets. Turn a crank, and the device could predict eclipses, chart lunar phases, and even mark the cycles of the ancient Olympic Games. Its gears were cut with teeth so fine and accurate that no mechanism of comparable complexity would be made again for more than 1,000 years. The discovery was both exhilarating and disturbing. Until the Antikythera mechanism surfaced, historians had believed that such intricate gearwork was unknown in antiquity. Greek astronomy was admired for its theoretical insights, but no one had imagined that those insights had been embodied in machines. And yet here was proof that the Greeks not only imagined the cosmos but built devices to model it. The Antikythera mechanism showed that ancient science was not merely abstract. It was mechanical, practical, and astonishingly advanced. X-ray analysis in the 20th and 21st centuries revealed the full genius of the mechanism. Within its fragments, scholars identified more than 30 bronze gears, carefully meshed to produce coordinated motion. On its face were dials that displayed the positions of celestial bodies according to complex cycles. The Metonic cycle of 19 years, by which lunar months repeat, was inscribed upon it. The Saros cycle of eclipses, lasting 18 years, was also included. Tiny Greek inscriptions explained its functions, noting when the sun and moon would align, when eclipses would darken the skies, when the Panhellenic Games would return. It was, in essence, a miniature cosmos, a clockwork universe in bronze. The sophistication of the device raises haunting questions. Who built it? How many existed? Was it the work of a single genius, perhaps a disciple of Hipparchus, or influenced by the great mathematician Archimedes? Or was it the product of a workshop tradition now lost, a line of mechanical knowledge that vanished in the collapse of antiquity? The fact that only one such device has been found suggests how fragile knowledge can be, how easily it can slip into silence. The Antikythera mechanism survived not because it was preserved, but because it was lost at sea, shielded by accident in a shipwreck. Its existence also forces us to rethink the narrative of progress. Modern culture often tells itself that technology advances steadily, each generation building upon the last. But the Antikythera mechanism shows that history is not linear. Knowledge can leap ahead, then vanish. It can burn brightly in one age, then be extinguished by war, collapse, or neglect, only to be rediscovered centuries later. The gears of the Antikythera mechanism remind us that the ancients were not primitive, but capable of brilliance equal to or beyond our expectations. What was lost with them, we can only guess. The device also reflects the Greek vision of the cosmos. To the builders of the Antikythera mechanism, the universe was ordered, harmonious, and knowable. The heavens moved according to cycles, and those cycles could be mapped, predicted, and represented in machinery. It was a worldview of rationality, of beauty expressed through mathematics. To turn the gears of the mechanism was to turn the heavens themselves, to hold in one's hands a model of eternity. And yet, the Antikythera mechanism was not merely scientific. It was cultural. Its dials included the calendar of athletic games, linking cosmic cycles to human festivals. It bound together astronomy, religion, and society, reminding us that for the ancients, science was not separate from life, but woven into it. The mechanism was as much about meaning as it was about measurement. Today, the fragments of the Antikythera mechanism rest in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, studied with ever more advanced tools. Each new scan reveals details overlooked before: hidden inscriptions, subtle gearwork, the traces of lost dials. Yet even now, the device is not fully reconstructed. Scholars debate its exact functions, its missing components, its place within ancient technology. It remains a riddle as much as a revelation. The Antikythera mechanism reminds us that the sea holds as many secrets as the land. For centuries, shipwrecks have swallowed treasures, but few have returned such a gift as this, a glimpse into the lost genius of the ancient world. It tells us that we have underestimated our ancestors, that the line between ancient and modern is thinner than we imagine. Pompeii preserved a city in ash. Göbekli Tepe preserved belief in stone. The Antikythera mechanism preserved knowledge in bronze. Each discovery forces us to rethink who we are and where we came from. And each reminds us that history is fragile, dependent on what chance allows us to recover. If Greece could hold such secrets beneath its seas, Egypt still held treasures beneath its sands. There, in the Valley of the Kings, another discovery would capture the imagination of the entire world: the tomb of a boy king, sealed in darkness for millennia, waiting to ignite the most famous archaeological moment of all time. In the autumn of 1922, the Valley of the Kings lay silent under the Egyptian Sunday. For centuries, explorers and tomb robbers alike had searched its cliffs and ravines, unearthing the burial chambers of pharaohs who had ruled during Egypt's New Kingdom. By then, most scholars believed the valley had given up its secrets. The great tombs of Ramses, Seti, and Hatshepsut had long been found, their treasures looted, their corridors stripped bare. But an English archaeologist named Howard Carter, stubborn and meticulous, refused to believe the valley was exhausted. He had spent years searching with little success, funded by the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, whose fortune supported the increasingly desperate expedition. Many mocked Carter's persistence, but he was certain that one last secret lay hidden in the rock. That November, Carter's workers uncovered a series of steps cut into the limestone, buried beneath debris at the base of a ramshackle workman's hut. Clearing the rubble, they found a sealed doorway stamped with the necropolis seal of the pharaohs. The excitement was electric. Carter knew that he might be standing before the entrance to a tomb untouched for thousands of years. He telegraphed Lord Carnarvon at once. "At last have made wonderful discovery in valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact." On November 26, Carter and Carnarvon stood together at the threshold. As workmen removed the blocking stones, Carter inserted a candle through a small opening and peered inside. His eyes adjusted to the flickering light. What he saw was not empty stone, but gold. Gold everywhere, gilded couches shaped like animals, chests, chariots, statues, all piled upon one another in dazzling disorder. Carnarvon, hardly able to breathe, asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter answered with words that would echo through history, "Yes, wonderful things." The tomb was that of Tutankhamun, a boy king who had reigned more than 3,000 years earlier, around 1332 to 1323 before the Common Era. He was little known in history, a minor pharaoh who died young and left few monuments. Yet because his tomb had remained sealed and largely intact, he would become the most famous pharaoh of all. For the first time, the modern world could glimpse the full wealth and splendor of an Egyptian royal burial, preserved almost exactly as it had been placed. The antechamber was filled with treasures: gilded beds, ceremonial couches, dismantled chariots, alabaster vessels, boxes inlaid with ivory and ebony. Each object bore traces of daily life transformed into ritual. Beyond lay the annex, crammed with food, wine, perfumes, and more furniture. The burial chamber itself, when finally opened, revealed 4 great gilded shrines nested one within another, filling the chamber wall to wall. Inside these shrines was a stone sarcophagus. Within the sarcophagus were 3 coffins, each placed inside the other. The innermost coffin, made of solid gold, held the mummified body of Tutankhamun. Upon his head rested the most iconic artifact in all of archaeology, a golden mask, inlaid with lapis lazuli, quartz, and obsidian, its serene features immortalizing the boy king's face for eternity. The discovery captured the world's imagination like no other. Newspapers splashed images of the treasures across their front pages. Crowds gathered at exhibitions to marvel at artifacts shipped to Cairo. For a generation weary after the First World War, Tutankhamun's tomb was a vision of wonder, a glimpse into a world of gods, kings, and eternal splendor. Egyptomania swept Europe and America. Jewelry, fashion, and architecture borrowed motifs from the tomb. Tutankhamun became not only a pharaoh of the past, but a cultural phenomenon of the present. Yet the tomb was more than spectacle. It provided unprecedented insight into ancient Egyptian religion and burial practices. Every object had meaning, every detail symbolic. The gilded shrines represented the layers of protection around the king, mirroring the cosmos itself. The amulets and jewelry placed upon his body carried spells to guide him in the afterlife. The golden mask was not merely adornment but a magical tool, believed to allow the spirit of the king to see and speak in the realm of the gods. The paintings on the burial chamber walls showed Tutankhamun welcomed by Osiris, the god of the underworld, ensuring his passage into eternity. The identity of Tutankhamun himself also intrigued scholars. He was a minor king, ascending the throne as a child around 9 years old. His reign lasted only a decade. He came to power after the turbulent rule of Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who had abandoned Egypt's traditional gods to worship the sun disk, Aten. Tutankhamun restored the old religion, returning the temples of Amun to prominence. Yet his sudden death, perhaps at age 18 or 19, left mysteries that still endure. Did he die of illness? Was he injured in an accident? Or was he the victim of intrigue? The tomb's treasures could not answer, but they kept the question alive. The excavation also revealed the delicate balance between discovery and preservation. As Carter's team worked, the tomb became a laboratory, filled with conservators struggling to stabilize fragile artifacts that crumbled upon exposure to air. Each object had to be documented, photographed, catalogued, and carefully removed. The process took nearly a decade, with Carter himself devoting the rest of his life to the task. Unlike earlier excavators, who had often stripped sites recklessly, Carter approached the tomb with meticulous care, recognizing its uniqueness. The fame of the discovery also gave rise to legend. When Lord Carnarvon died suddenly in Cairo in 1923, rumors spread that a curse had struck him. The vengeance of the pharaoh. Newspapers whispered of omens, of strange lights in the desert, of mysterious illnesses afflicting those who entered the tomb. The so-called curse of Tutankhamun became a media sensation, adding a layer of myth to the already dazzling discovery. Scholars dismissed it as superstition, but the story endured, feeding the imagination of millions. Beyond myth and spectacle, Tutankhamun's tomb altered archaeology itself. It shifted the field from treasure hunting to scientific study, from plundering to preservation. It showed that a tomb could be more than gold. It could be a window into belief, ritual, and daily life. The smallest objects, from sandals to toys, revealed as much as the great shrines. The discovery reminded the world that archaeology is not about wealth, but about memory, about voices carried across time in wood, stone, and metal. Tutankhamun's legacy endures not only in museums, but in our collective imagination. His mask remains one of the most recognized images on Earth, a symbol of the mystery and splendor of ancient Egypt. The tomb continues to raise questions, not only about the boy king, but about how history is remembered. Had his tomb been looted like the others, Tutankhamun would have remained a footnote. Instead, he became a star. Chance preserved him, and through him, we glimpse a civilization that sought eternity in gold and ritual. Tutankhamun's tomb reminds us that archaeology is shaped as much by luck as by science. A hut built by workmen covered the steps to his resting place, shielding it from looters for 3 millennia. A stubborn archaeologist refused to give up when others had turned away. A moment of persistence met a moment of chance, and the result was the most famous discovery in the history of archaeology. But gold was not the only treasure the earth preserved. While Tutankhamun dazzled the world with splendor, another discovery, far away in China, would astonish with scale. There, buried in pits near the tomb of China's first emperor, thousands of clay warriors stood in silent ranks, guarding their master for eternity. If Tutankhamun revealed the wealth of a single boy king, the terracotta army revealed the ambition of an empire. In the spring of 1974, in the dry plains of Shaanxi province near the ancient city of Xi'an, farmers digging a well struck something hard beneath the earth. Expecting stone, they uncovered fragments of clay, a face here, a hand there, shards of armor and weapons. At first, they thought little of it, until more pieces emerged, then entire figures. Word reached local authorities, and soon archaeologists descended upon the site. What they uncovered astonished the world, an underground army of life-sized clay warriors standing in perfect battle formation, guarding the tomb of China's first emperor. The Terracotta Army, as it became known, was created more than 2,200 years ago during the reign of Qin Shi Huang, who unified China in 221 before the Common Era. His achievements were monumental. He ended centuries of warring states, standardized weights, measures, and coinage, and began the first version of the Great Wall. But his ambition extended beyond life. Obsessed with immortality, he ordered the construction of a vast mausoleum complex to ensure his eternal power. The Terracotta Army was part of that vision, an eternal garrison to guard him in the afterlife. The scale of the discovery defies imagination. To date, archaeologists have unearthed more than 8,000 clay warriors, along with horses, chariots, and weapons, arranged in battle formations within vast pits. Each figure stands about 2 meters tall, armored and armed, and remarkably, no two faces are alike. The soldiers vary in expression, hairstyle, rank, and uniform, reflecting an astonishing level of craftsmanship and individuality. The effect is overwhelming, a silent army frozen in eternal vigilance, ready to march at the command of their emperor. The construction of the Terracotta Army was an undertaking of staggering complexity. Historical records suggest that more than 700,000 workers labored for decades to complete the mausoleum and its army. Artisans sculpted the figures in parts, assembling heads, torsos, arms, and legs before firing them in kilns. The figures were once brightly painted, adorned with vivid reds, blues, and greens that have mostly faded with time. Weapons of bronze swords, spears, crossbows were placed in their hands, many still sharp after millennia, thanks to advanced preservation techniques involving chromium oxide, a discovery that startled modern scientists. The warriors were arranged in precise formations, reflecting real military organization, complete with infantry, archers, cavalry, and charioteers. The detail extends to the smallest elements: the tread on shoes, the knots of belts, the creases of armor. Each soldier appears as an individual, yet together they form a collective force, a portrait of Qin's army preserved for eternity. The message is unmistakable. The emperor commanded not only in life but in death, his power extending beyond the grave. But the Terracotta Army is only a part of the greater mausoleum complex, which remains largely unexcavated. Ancient texts describe a vast underground palace, rivers of mercury flowing to mimic the waterways of China, a ceiling studded with gems to represent the night sky. Tests of the soil around the tomb mound have indeed revealed unusually high levels of mercury, suggesting that the accounts may be true. Yet the central tomb of Qin Shi Huang remains unopened. Concerns about preservation and fears of damaging what lies within have left it sealed. The emperor still waits in darkness, guarded by his clay legions. The discovery of the Terracotta Army reshaped our understanding of ancient China. It revealed not only the power of Qin Shi Huang, but the artistry and technological sophistication of his time. The scale of the project demonstrated centralized authority capable of mobilizing massive resources. The individuality of the figures revealed an artistry that combined mass production with human detail. The chemical preservation of weapons hinted at scientific knowledge long ahead of its time. In every way, the Terracotta Army was both a political statement and a work of genius. For the world, the discovery was a revelation. Like Tutankhamun's tomb in Egypt, the Terracotta Army captured the imagination of millions. Exhibitions of the warriors traveled across the globe, drawing crowds eager to gaze upon the faces of soldiers who had stood in silence for over 2 millennia. The warriors became icons of China's ancient heritage, symbols of both power and mystery. Yet the Terracotta Army also raises haunting questions. How much more lies buried within the emperor's tomb? Do the accounts of rivers of mercury, of palaces and treasures, reflect reality or legend? What secrets would the central chamber reveal if opened? Archaeology, for now, exercises restraint. The tools to safely excavate such a site without damage may not yet exist. Like Göbekli Tepe, much of the mystery remains sealed, waiting for future generations. The Terracotta Army is more than a burial site. It is a vision of immortality, carved in clay. It embodies the paradox of human ambition, the desire to control not only life but death itself. Qin Shi Huang sought to rule forever, and in a sense, he succeeded. Though his body turned to dust, his army endures, a force that has marched across time into our present. In the silence of the pits near Xi'an, thousands of clay soldiers still stand at attention, their watch unbroken. They remind us that empires rise and fall, but the human drive to leave a mark, to command eternity, persists. The Terracotta Army is not merely a monument to one emperor, it is a testament to humanity's endless struggle against the limits of mortality. Tutankhamun's tomb showed the wealth of a single boy king. The Terracotta Army shows the ambition of an emperor who sought to command an empire forever. Yet both reveal the same truth, that the dead do not rest quietly. They shape the living, binding us to their memory. And just as tombs and armies lay hidden beneath sand and soil, entire cities have lain forgotten under vines and stone. High in the mountains of South America, another discovery would remind the world that civilizations can vanish almost entirely, leaving behind only echoes in stone. That discovery was Machu Picchu, the lost citadel of the Incas, waiting for its rediscovery above the clouds. High in the mountains of Peru, where the ridges of the Andes slice the sky and rivers cut deep gorges through green valleys, there lies a city that seems to hover between earth and heaven. Machu Picchu, the lost citadel of the Inca, was unknown to the outside world for centuries. For locals, it was a place remembered in whispers, a hidden site shrouded in mist. For historians, it did not exist at all until 1911, when an American explorer named Hiram Bingham, guided by villagers, climbed the ridge of a mountain and stumbled upon terraces, walls, and temples swallowed by vines and time. What he saw that day was staggering. Stone walls rose with precision, their blocks fitted so tightly that not even a blade of grass could slip between them. Terraces stepped down the mountain slopes in endless green cascades, harnessing the land for agriculture. Temples opened onto plazas, aligned with the sun, the stars, and the solstices. The city had the grandeur of a royal capital and the serenity of a sanctuary, a place where human craftsmanship and nature's majesty merged seamlessly. Machu Picchu was built in the 15th century under the reign of Pachacuti, one of the greatest rulers of the Inca Empire. The Incas commanded a vast domain stretching from Ecuador to Chile, linked by roads and rope bridges across some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. Yet they left no written records. Their history survives in oral tradition, and in the quipu, chords knotted in patterns whose meanings remain elusive. Machu Picchu, then, became one of the keys to understanding how the Incas lived, ruled, and worshipped. The site is divided into sacred and residential zones. In the sacred area stand the Temple of the Sun, with its curved walls and astronomical windows, and the Intihuatana stone, thought to have been used as a solar calendar or ritual altar. In the residential zones lie houses, workshops, and storage rooms, showing how the city functioned in daily life. At its height, Machu Picchu may have housed several hundred residents, perhaps members of the Inca elite, priests, and chosen attendants. Its terraces reveal ingenious engineering, channeling water, stabilizing slopes, and creating microclimates for crops. In every stone, the Incas displayed mastery not only of architecture, but of environment. What strikes modern visitors most is the setting. Machu Picchu clings to a ridge between two peaks, Machu Picchu Mountain and Huayna Picchu, surrounded on all sides by plunging valleys. Mist rolls across the terraces, and the Urubamba River winds far below. It is a place where the natural world dominates, yet the Incas carved order into its chaos. The city feels both hidden and exalted, as if deliberately placed to touch the heavens. Some scholars believe it was a royal estate, others a sacred retreat, a place where rulers communed with the gods of sun, mountain, and water. Whatever its function, its beauty is undeniable. The rediscovery of Machu Picchu captured global imagination. For Western audiences, it seemed like a city out of myth, a lost world suddenly revealed. But to Andean people, it was part of a living landscape of memory, a reminder of their ancestors' ingenuity. In the century since its discovery, Machu Picchu has become a symbol of Peru, one of the most visited archaeological sites on Earth, and a UNESCO World Heritage treasure. Yet the influx of tourism has also raised questions about preservation, as foot traffic and environmental changes threaten the fragile terraces and stones. The challenge of Machu Picchu today is to balance reverence with protection, so that the city endures for future generations. Machu Picchu also reshaped how scholars view the Inca Empire. Far from being a culture erased by conquest, the Incas are now understood as extraordinary engineers and organizers, capable of sustaining millions of people without wheels, iron, or beasts of burden beyond the llama. Their stonework withstands earthquakes that topple modern buildings. Their terraces prevent erosion on slopes that would collapse under lesser hands. Their road system, stretching for tens of thousands of kilometers, bound together mountains, deserts, and forests into a coherent empire. Machu Picchu crystallizes that genius in one site, preserved against all odds. Yet even Machu Picchu is only part of the story. Across the Andes lie countless ruins, many still hidden beneath vegetation, others eroded by time. The Spanish conquest in the 16th century sought not only to seize wealth but to erase memory, to dismantle temples and idols. Much was lost, but the stones endure. Machu Picchu is a reminder that no empire, however great, is truly gone. Its echoes remain in mountains, rivers, and ruins that still whisper of forgotten civilizations. The city also poses enduring mysteries. Why was it abandoned? Some suggest disease or Spanish encroachment forced its desertion. Others argue it was never a true city but a seasonal estate, used only at certain times of the year. Without written records, certainty may be impossible. Yet, in a sense, the mystery is part of its power. Machu Picchu draws us not because it answers all questions, but because it leaves some unanswered, inviting imagination to fill the gaps. Standing among its terraces, one feels both awe and melancholy. Awe at the ingenuity that could raise such a place amid the clouds. Melancholy at the fragility of civilizations, how they rise, flourish, and vanish, leaving behind only stone. Machu Picchu, like Pompeii, like Göbekli Tepe, is both presence and absence, a voice carried across centuries that speaks but never fully explains. For the Incas, the city was sacred, a meeting point between the earth below and the sky above. For us, it is a window into a world nearly erased, a reminder that the past is vast, layered, and unfinished. Machu Picchu tells us that even when conquest seeks to silence, memory endures in mountains and walls. And yet, as awe-inspiring as Machu Picchu is, it is not the oldest ruin, nor the final mystery. Archaeology continues to find evidence of cities buried beneath forests, revealed by lasers piercing the jungle canopy. It uncovers drowned landscapes beneath seas, where rising waters swallowed entire worlds. Each new discovery pushes the timeline of civilization further back, reminding us that what we know is only a fraction of what has been. Machu Picchu reminds us that civilizations can vanish but not be forgotten. The next discoveries remind us that civilizations can vanish and be hidden completely, awaiting the tools and patience of modern science to bring them back into the light. Archaeology has always been a conversation between the past and the present, a dialogue carried out through fragments of stone, bone, and ink. For centuries, discoveries seem to arrive by chance: a farmer's plough striking a statue, a shepherd stumbling upon a scroll, a diver surfacing with a bronze gear. But the 21st century has brought new tools that change the game entirely. Now, instead of waiting for accident, we can seek with precision. We can scan jungles with lasers, peer beneath deserts with satellites, and probe the ocean floor with submersibles. The Earth itself is becoming transparent, and with each layer revealed, our understanding of civilization deepens. One of the most powerful of these tools is LiDAR, light detection and ranging, which uses laser pulses to map terrain with extraordinary accuracy. In Central America, LiDAR has revolutionized the study of the Maya. For generations, thick jungle concealed the outlines of ancient cities. Explorers hacked through vines to find temples rising from the undergrowth, but they could only guess at the full scale. Now, with LiDAR scanning from aircraft, entire landscapes are unveiled. Beneath the canopy, archaeologists see vast networks of roads, canals, terraces, and fortresses. Cities once thought to hold tens of thousands are now understood to have supported millions. The Maya were not isolated kingdoms, but part of a complex, interconnected civilization that rivaled any in the ancient world. In Cambodia, LiDAR has done the same for Angkor, the medieval capital of the Khmer Empire. Once, the jungle had reduced Angkor to a scattering of famous temples like Angkor Wat, leaving the impression of a city that was monumental but limited. LiDAR revealed that Angkor was far larger than imagined, a sprawling metropolis with an intricate grid of roads, reservoirs, and neighborhoods. Its population may have numbered in the hundreds of thousands, making it one of the largest cities of its time. The fall of Angkor was not a simple collapse, but a complex transformation, and its rediscovery reshapes how we think about resilience and decline. Satellites extend this vision further. From orbit, we can trace faint lines across deserts where once roads and walls stood. In Egypt, satellites have revealed buried pyramids and forgotten settlements beneath the sands, invisible to the naked eye but clear in the patterns of heat and light detected from above. Across Mesopotamia, satellite imagery has mapped thousands of tells, mounds concealing ancient towns. What once took lifetimes of exploration can now be glimpsed in a single pass of technology. Yet, even with these tools, the Earth keeps many of its secrets, waiting for the careful spade of excavation to bring them into light. And then there is the ocean. More than 2/3 of the planet lies beneath water, and much of it has never been explored. Rising seas after the last ice age drowned vast stretches of coastline, submerging the places where early humans built their first settlements. Beneath waves and sediment may lie cities older than any yet discovered, waiting in silence. Already, divers and sonar have found stone structures off the coast of India near Dwarka, terraces beneath the waters of Japan near Yonaguni, ruins swallowed by the Black Sea. Each find is debated, some argued to be natural formations, others possible remnants of human hands. But the ocean is vast, and its depths are largely unmapped. If Göbekli Tepe rewrote history on land, the seafloor may one day do the same, on a scale we can scarcely imagine. The discoveries yet to come are not only about scale, but about intimacy. Ancient DNA, preserved in bones, seeds, and even soil, is unlocking family ties, migrations, and forgotten populations. Chemical analysis of pottery reveals what people ate, what they traded, how they lived. Microscopic wear on tools shows how they were used. The past is no longer silent. It speaks through every trace, from the grandest temple to the smallest grain of pollen trapped in a shard of clay. Yet these new tools also remind us of fragility. As climate change, development, and looting threaten sites, we may lose knowledge faster than we gain it. Cities vanish under rising seas. Forests are cut before they can be scanned. Sites are looted before they can be studied. Archaeology is a race against time, a race to preserve not only artifacts but the stories they tell. Still, the momentum is undeniable. Each year brings revelations that once seemed impossible. Where once Troy was a myth, now we map entire landscapes unseen for millennia. Where once the Rosetta Stone opened a single language, now algorithms translate lost scripts. Where once a diver found a single corroded gear, now we recover entire systems of ancient knowledge. The pace of discovery is accelerating, and with it, the sense that history is not finished but unfolding. The most haunting truth is that every discovery reshapes not only the past but the present. The Rosetta Stone taught us to listen to lost voices. Troy taught us that myth may be memory. The Dead Sea Scrolls taught us that faith evolves. Pompeii taught us that ordinary lives matter. Göbekli Tepe taught us that belief came before farming. The Antikythera mechanism taught us that genius is fragile. Tutankhamun's tomb taught us that chance shapes legacy. The Terracotta Army taught us that ambition seeks eternity. Machu Picchu taught us that civilizations can vanish but endure in memory. Each site is not only a story of what was, but a mirror of what is. What then? will the next discoveries teach us? Perhaps that civilizations rose and fell long before we thought. Perhaps that myths of floods and cataclysms echo real events recorded in drowned landscapes. Perhaps that our assumptions about progress are illusions, and that knowledge can be lost and reborn like a cycle of stars. The search continues, in deserts, in forests, in caves, and beneath oceans. Each stone, each shard, each fragment of script carries the weight of humanity's journey. Archaeology is not about the past alone. It is about who we are and who we may yet become. The story of discovery is unfinished. The earth still holds secrets. The sea still holds cities. The stars still hold calendars carved in stone. We are not the end of history. We are its latest chapter. And as we listen to the whispers of ruins, as we follow the trails of myth and memory, one truth becomes clear. The past is not silent. It speaks endlessly, waiting for us to hear.